in the narrow streets of San Francisco's Chinatown in 1920, where the smell of incense and cooking spices mingled with the salt air from the bay and the fog rolled through the alleyways like gray ghosts searching for lost memories. There lived a family whose tragedy would become one of the most disturbing mysteries in the history of child psychology and linguistic study. The Chen family occupied a modest apartment above their small grocery store on Washington Street, living the immigrant dream of hard work and modest prosperity, raising their daughter Dorothy in the traditional ways while also embracing their new American life. They were ordinary people, unremarkable in every way except for what would happen to their daughter in the spring of 1920, when 9-year-old Dorothy Chen woke one morning and began speaking in languages that should not exist, in tongues that had been silent for millennia, sharing knowledge that no child should possess, and that would ultimately cost her everything, including her sanity, her childhood, and perhaps her very soul. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge our understanding of memory, consciousness, and the possibility that some knowledge might come from sources beyond our comprehension. The Chen family had immigrated to San Francisco in 1908, part of a wave of Chinese families who had established the thriving community that made Chinatown one of the city's most vibrant neighborhoods, despite the discrimination and legal restrictions Chinese immigrants faced in early 20th century America. William Chen, Dorothy's father, was 42 years old in 1920, a hard-working man who had built his grocery business from nothing, starting as a street vendor and gradually accumulating enough capital to rent a storefront and apartment. He worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, rising before dawn to purchase produce and goods at the wholesale markets, and staying open until late evening to serve the community. Dorothy's mother, May Chen, was 36 years old, a quiet woman with traditional values who managed the household, kept the account books for the store, and ensured that Dorothy received both a proper American education at the public school and instruction in Chinese language, history, and culture at home. Dorothy herself was their only child, born in 1911 after May had suffered 2 miscarriages and had almost given up hope of motherhood. She was a bright, cheerful girl with long black hair that her mother braided each morning, dark brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with curiosity, and a quick mind that made her teachers at the Grant Avenue School predict she would achieve great things. She spoke English and Cantonese fluently, could read at a level several years beyond her age, showed particular talent for mathematics, and had a remarkable memory that allowed her to recite long passages of text after reading them only once. By all accounts, Dorothy was a normal, healthy, intelligent child, beloved by her parents, popular with her classmates, showing every sign of growing into a successful young woman. The Chen apartment above the grocery store consisted of 4 small rooms arranged in a line, a sitting room at the front overlooking Washington Street, a kitchen in the middle with a small stove and a table where the family ate their meals, and 2 bedrooms at the back, one for William and May, and one for Dorothy. The walls were painted pale green, and May had decorated the space with traditional Chinese paintings and calligraphy scrolls that her own mother had given her before she left China. Dorothy's room was particularly neat, with a narrow bed covered in a quilt that May had made by hand, a small desk where Dorothy did her homework each evening, and shelves filled with books, some in English from the school library and others in Chinese, that taught history and poetry and the stories of ancient dynasties. It was a warm, loving home, and Dorothy was growing up surrounded by the dual heritage of her Chinese roots and her American present, seemingly well-adjusted and happy. The change came on the morning of March 15, 1920, a Monday that had begun like any other. Dorothy had gone to bed the previous evening at her usual time, after finishing her homework and eating dinner with her parents. She had seemed perfectly normal, chatting about her school day, practicing her English spelling words with her mother, helping her father count the day's receipts from the store. But when May went to wake Dorothy for school the next morning, She found her daughter sitting up in bed, eyes open but with a strange unfocused quality, staring at the wall and speaking in a continuous stream of words that May could not understand. At first, May thought Dorothy was speaking some form of Chinese that she didn't recognize, perhaps reciting something she had learned at the Chinese language school she attended on Saturday mornings. But as May listened more carefully, she realized that the sounds Dorothy was making were not Cantonese, not Mandarin, not any of the Chinese dialects that May had heard during her life in Guangdong province. The words had a strange rhythm and cadence, flowing together in patterns that seemed structured like language, but using sounds and combinations that were utterly foreign. When May called William, he came immediately and listened to Dorothy speak. He too recognized that this was language, not just random sounds, but he had no idea what language it might be. When they tried to get Dorothy's attention, she didn't respond, just continued speaking in that strange tongue, her eyes staring straight ahead, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her voice maintaining an even, almost hypnotic quality. This continued for nearly 20 minutes before Dorothy suddenly stopped speaking, blinked several times as if waking from sleep, and looked at her parents with her normal cheerful expression, asking what was wrong and why they were both staring at her. When asked about what she had been saying, Dorothy seemed confused, claiming she didn't remember speaking at all, that the last thing she remembered was going to sleep the night before. William and May exchanged worried glances, but decided that perhaps Dorothy had been talking in her sleep, that it was some kind of strange dream that would not repeat itself. They sent her to school after a quick breakfast, though both parents remained uneasy about what they had witnessed. But that evening, when Dorothy sat down to do her homework, the strange speaking began again. She was working on arithmetic problems when suddenly she stopped, her pencil frozen mid-equation, and began speaking in what sounded like a completely different language from the one she had spoken that morning. This language had a harsher sound, with hard consonants and rolling R's that seemed to come from deep in her throat. Again, Dorothy seemed unaware that she was speaking, her eyes taking on that distant, unfocused quality. Again, she spoke for 15 or 20 minutes before stopping abruptly and returning to her homework as if nothing had happened, with no memory of the episode. Over the following week, these episodes became more frequent and more disturbing. Dorothy would suddenly begin speaking in strange languages at random times throughout the day, during meals, while walking to school, in the middle of conversations. Each time she seemed to be speaking a different language with its own distinct sounds and patterns. Each time she had no memory of the episode afterward, returning to her normal self as if a switch had been flipped. William and May brought Dorothy to see Dr. James Harrison, an American physician who had a practice serving both Chinese and white patients in the area near Chinatown. Dr. Harrison examined Dorothy thoroughly, checking for fever, neurological problems, signs of injury or illness. He found nothing physically wrong with the child. When he asked Dorothy to demonstrate the strange speaking, she looked at him blankly, having no conscious control over when the episodes occurred and no memory of what she said during them. Dr. Harrison suggested that perhaps Dorothy was experiencing some form of psychological distress, possibly related to the pressure of being caught between two cultures, Chinese at home and American at school. He recommended rest and careful observation, but offered no real explanation for what was happening. The episodes continued to increase in frequency. By the end of March, Dorothy was experiencing 6 to 8 episodes per day, each lasting between 10 and 30 minutes. During these times, she would speak fluently in what appeared to be structured languages, her voice taking on different tones and inflections with each new tongue. May began keeping a journal documenting each episode, noting the time, duration, and distinctive characteristics of each language Dorothy spoke. What May noticed and what would later become crucial evidence in the case, was that the languages seemed to repeat in a cycle. Dorothy would speak language 1, then language 2, then language 3, and so on, eventually returning to language 1 and starting the cycle again. May counted 14 distinct languages, each with its own unique sound patterns, each apparently structured with grammar and vocabulary, each completely incomprehensible to anyone who heard it. The Chen family's minister at the Chinatown Presbyterian Church, Reverend Samuel Wong, suggested that they consult Dr. Robert Mackenzie, a professor of linguistics at the University of California in Berkeley, who had a reputation for expertise in obscure languages and dialects. On April 2, 1920, William and May brought Dorothy to Dr. Mackenzie's office, hoping that he might be able to identify the languages their daughter was speaking, and perhaps explain why this was happening. Dr. Robert Mackenzie was 54 years old, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a scholarly demeanor. He had spent 30 years studying languages, publishing numerous papers on linguistic evolution and the relationships between ancient and modern tongues. He was particularly interested in dead languages, those that had once been spoken but had died out as civilizations fell and cultures transformed. When the Chens explained Dorothy's condition, Dr. Mackenzie was skeptical, suspecting that the child might be speaking gibberish that only sounded like language. But his skepticism disappeared the moment Dorothy had one of her episodes in his presence. The language that came from Dorothy's lips during that first episode in Dr. Mackenzie's office was unmistakably structured. Dr. Mackenzie, whose ear was trained to detect linguistic patterns, immediately recognized that Dorothy was speaking with consistent phonology, apparent grammar rules, and what seemed to be coherent vocabulary. But he could not identify the language. It wasn't Chinese in any form. It wasn't Japanese or Korean or any Asian language he knew. It wasn't European. It didn't match any of the hundreds of languages and dialects he had studied during his career. Over the following weeks, Dr. Mackenzie observed Dorothy during 48 separate episodes, carefully documenting each language she spoke. He recorded her speech using a primitive wax cylinder recording device, capturing hours of audio that he could analyze in detail. He brought in colleagues from the linguistics department, scholars who specialized in various language families from around the world. None of them could identify any of the 14 languages that Dorothy spoke. What made the case even more remarkable was that the languages Dorothy spoke appeared to be genuinely sophisticated. Dr. Mackenzie's analysis revealed consistent grammatical structures, extensive vocabularies, and phonological patterns that suggested highly developed linguistic systems. These were not the simple invented languages of a child's imagination, but complex tongues that showed the kind of evolution and refinement that typically required centuries of use by large populations of speakers. Dr. Mackenzie began to suspect that Dorothy might somehow be speaking in dead languages, tongues that had existed in ancient times but had been lost to history. He consulted specialists in ancient languages, scholars who studied Sumerian, ancient Egyptian, classical Greek, Latin, and various other historical tongues. He even reached out to colleagues in Europe who were working on deciphering Linear A, the undeciphered Minoan script from ancient Crete. But none of the experts could match Dorothy's languages to any known historical tongue. The languages she spoke seemed to come from somewhere outside the documented record of human linguistic history. The mystery deepened when Dr. Mackenzie began to analyze the content of what Dorothy was saying. He noticed that within each language, Dorothy seemed to be speaking about specific topics. Language 1 appeared to describe astronomical phenomena, with repeated references to what sounded like celestial movements in cosmic cycles. Language 2 seemed to discuss agricultural practices, with terms that might refer to crops and seasons, and harvesting techniques. Language 3 appeared to be religious or philosophical in nature, discussing concepts that might relate to death, rebirth, and the nature of existence. Each language seemed to contain knowledge about specific domains, as if Dorothy were accessing different repositories of information with each tongue she spoke. Dr. Mackenzie attempted to have Dorothy write down what she was saying, hoping that a written form might provide additional clues. During one episode, he placed paper and a pen in front of Dorothy and gently guided her hand to the page. What resulted was a series of written symbols that looked like a writing system, but not one that matched any known script. The characters were complex, involving curved lines, dots, and geometric shapes arranged in patterns that suggested they were representing the sounds of the language Dorothy was speaking. Dr. Mackenzie had Dorothy write in several of her languages, each time producing a different writing system, each one consistent within itself. But unlike any historical or modern script in the linguistic record, by May of 1920, word of Dorothy Chen's case had spread through the academic community. Linguists from across America began traveling to San Francisco to observe the girl who spoke in unknown tongues. Dr. Heinrich Schreiber came from Yale, where he taught comparative linguistics and had studied over 200 languages during his career. Dr. Margaret Ashford traveled from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where she specialized in Native American languages and had documented dozens of tribal tongues. Dr. Pierre Beaumont arrived from the Sorbonne in Paris, an expert in ancient Mediterranean languages who had spent years studying inscriptions from Phoenician, Etruscan, and other extinct civilizations. Each of these scholars observed Dorothy, recorded her speech, analyzed her languages. Each reached the same conclusion. Dorothy Chen was speaking in languages that were structured, sophisticated, and completely unidentifiable. Not only could they not determine what languages she was speaking, they couldn't even identify what language families these tongues might belong to. The phonological patterns, grammatical structures, and apparent vocabularies seemed to bear no relationship to any known human language. It was as if Dorothy had somehow gained access to linguistic systems from outside the documented history of human civilization. The effect on Dorothy herself was devastating. The episodes had initially been painless, with Dorothy returning to normal consciousness with no memory or distress. But by June, the transitions had become more difficult. Dorothy would emerge from episodes with severe headaches, sometimes nausea, occasionally nosebleeds. She became withdrawn and frightened, afraid to go to school because she never knew when an episode would occur, terrified by the gaps in her memory where hours of her life had disappeared. She stopped playing with other children, stopped reading her beloved books, stopped eating regular meals. Her parents watched helplessly as their bright, cheerful daughter transformed into a frightened, fragile child who seemed to be carrying a burden far too heavy for a 9-year-old to bear. Dr. Mackenzie and his colleagues recognized that while Dorothy's condition was a linguistic marvel, it was also a medical and psychological crisis. They brought in Dr. Evelyn Foster, a child psychologist from San Francisco General Hospital, to evaluate Dorothy's mental state. Dr. Foster's assessment was deeply troubling. Dorothy was experiencing severe psychological trauma from the episodes, developing what would today be recognized as symptoms of dissociative disorder. She felt that her body was being taken over by forces she couldn't control, that her mind was not entirely her own, that she was losing herself piece by piece every time an episode occurred. Dr. Foster strongly recommended that the academic observations cease, that Dorothy be given time to rest and recover, that the family's privacy be protected. But the linguists were reluctant to stop their research, arguing that Dorothy's case represented a unique opportunity to understand something fundamental about language and consciousness. A compromise was reached where observations would continue, but would be limited to 3 sessions per week, each no longer than 2 hours, with Dorothy's comfort and welfare as the primary concern. During one particularly detailed observation session in late June, Dr. Mackenzie noticed something that had escaped previous attention. When Dorothy spoke in what he had designated as Language 7, she occasionally used phrases that could be translated by reference to ancient Sumerian. Not exact matches, but close enough to suggest that Language 7 might be a relative of Sumerian, or perhaps a predecessor to it. This was the first breakthrough in understanding Dorothy's languages. Dr. Schreiber from Yale, working independently, discovered that Language 3 showed structural similarities to Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor of most European and many Asian languages. Again, not exact matches, but enough similarities to suggest a relationship. The implications were staggering. If Dorothy was somehow speaking languages that were predecessors to or relatives of the oldest known human languages, she was accessing linguistic knowledge from periods of human history for which no written records existed. These would be languages spoken thousands of years before writing was invented. Languages that should have left no trace in the historical record. Languages that existed only in the reconstructed speculations of linguists who worked backward from modern tongues. But how could a 9-year-old Chinese-American girl in San Francisco possibly have access to such knowledge? The academic community proposed several theories. Some suggested that Dorothy might be exhibiting an extreme case of cryptomnesia, accessing linguistic information she had been exposed to at some point, but had no conscious memory of learning. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. Dorothy had never been exposed to linguistic texts or scholarly discussions. She had attended American public school and Chinese language school, learning English and Cantonese but nothing else. Her parents were working-class immigrants with no academic background. There was simply no source from which Dorothy could have learned even one ancient language, let alone 14 of them. Other scholars proposed that Dorothy might be exhibiting some form of genetic memory, accessing linguistic knowledge that had been encoded in human DNA through thousands of generations. This theory suggested that humanity's linguistic past might somehow be stored in our genetic code, and that Dorothy had somehow gained conscious access to this normally inaccessible information. But this theory was equally problematic. It required accepting mechanisms of genetic memory that had no scientific basis, and it couldn't explain why Dorothy's languages didn't match any documented human tongues. A third theory, proposed quietly and reluctantly by some of the more spiritually inclined researchers, was that Dorothy might be channeling information from some external source, either from the spirits of people who had spoken these languages in ancient times, or from some other non-physical source of knowledge. This theory was dismissed by most of the academic observers as unscientific superstition, but it persisted in private discussions because it was the only explanation that didn't require impossible assumptions about human memory and learning. The truth was that no one could explain what was happening to Dorothy Chen. By August of 1920, Dorothy's condition had deteriorated significantly. The episodes now occurred every 2 to 3 hours, with some lasting nearly an hour. Dorothy was no longer attending school, spending most of her time in her bedroom, emerging only for meals that she barely touched. She had lost considerable weight, her face had taken on a hollow, haunted appearance, and her eyes had developed a permanently distant quality, as if she were looking through the visible world into something beyond. Her parents were desperate, begging the doctors to do something, anything, to help their daughter. But there was nothing medical science could do. Dr. Harrison prescribed sedatives, but they had no effect on the episodes. Dr. Foster tried various psychological interventions, but Dorothy's condition was beyond any known therapeutic approach. The linguistic researchers continued their observations, but they could offer no help, only increasingly elaborate theories that explained nothing. On September 3, 1920, during an observation session in Dr. Mackenzie's office, something happened that would change the entire nature of the case. Dorothy was in the middle of an episode, speaking in language 12, when suddenly she stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes, which had been distant and unfocused, suddenly sharpened and focused directly on Dr. Mackenzie, and she spoke in perfect English. "They want me to come with them. They say I have learned enough. They say it's time to cross over." Dr. Mackenzie later testified that Dorothy's voice during this moment was different from her normal voice, deeper and older sounding, as if someone or something else was speaking through her. He asked who they were, and Dorothy responded, still in that strange altered voice, "The ones who came before. The ones who spoke these tongues when the world was young. They say I am a bridge between their time and this time, that I was chosen to carry their knowledge forward, but that the burden is too great for one so small. They offer me a choice. I can continue to carry this weight, and perhaps be destroyed by it, or I can go with them to the place where these languages still live, where the knowledge is kept and preserved. They say I can choose." Dr. Mackenzie, deeply shaken but trying to maintain scientific objectivity, asked what choice Dorothy would make. But before she could answer, the episode ended, and Dorothy returned to her normal consciousness, with no memory of what had just been said. Dr. Mackenzie immediately contacted Dorothy's parents and Dr. Foster, describing what had occurred. A meeting was convened to discuss what this might mean and how to proceed. But before any decisions could be made, Dorothy made her choice for them. On the morning of September 7, 1920, May Chen entered Dorothy's bedroom to wake her daughter for breakfast. She found Dorothy sitting on her bed, her legs crossed in a meditation pose that she had never used before, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes open but completely white, as if the irises and pupils had disappeared. And Dorothy was speaking, but not in any of the 14 languages that had been documented. This was something new, a language that sounded like all the others combined, a linguistic synthesis that flowed and shifted and changed with every phrase. May screamed for William, who came running. They tried to wake Dorothy, to get her attention, but she didn't respond to their voices or their touch. She just continued speaking in that shifting, changing language, her white eyes staring at nothing, her body perfectly still except for the movement of her lips forming those incomprehensible words. Dr. Harrison was summoned, then Dr. Mackenzie, then Dr. Foster. By early afternoon, Dorothy's bedroom was filled with doctors and researchers, all watching helplessly as the 9-year-old girl spoke in tongues that seemed to be drawing her away from the world they all shared. The speaking continued for 7 hours without pause, Dorothy never showing any sign of fatigue, never stopping for breath, the words flowing in an endless stream. And then, at exactly 6:47 p.m., according to Dr. Mackenzie's pocket watch, Dorothy stopped speaking. Her white eyes blinked once, twice, and when they opened again, they were her normal dark brown. She looked at her parents and smiled. A genuine smile of peace and contentment that they hadn't seen on her face in months. "I love you," she said in Cantonese. "Don't be sad. Where I'm going is beautiful." And then Dorothy Chen simply ceased to exist. Not died, not collapsed, not fell into unconsciousness. She simply vanished, her body fading from visibility over the course of approximately 30 seconds, while everyone in the room watched in horror and disbelief. Dr. Mackenzie later wrote in his private journal that he watched Dorothy become translucent, like pale glass, saw her fade to the point where he could see through her to the wall behind. And then she was gone, leaving behind only a small depression in the bed where she had been sitting, and the faint smell of incense that hadn't been burning. The room erupted in chaos. May collapsed, screaming. William tore through the room looking for his daughter, checking the closet, under the bed, refusing to believe what his eyes had seen. Dr. Harrison insisted that everyone must have experienced some form of mass hallucination, that Dorothy must have run from the room somehow, that there must be a rational explanation. But Dr. Mackenzie, trained to observe and document, had to acknowledge what he had witnessed. Dorothy Chen had vanished from physical existence, apparently taken to the place she had called where these languages still live, where the knowledge is kept and preserved. A police investigation was launched, led by Detective Thomas O'Brien of the San Francisco Police Department. He interviewed everyone who had been present in Dorothy's bedroom that evening, examined the room for any signs of how a child might have escaped, questioned neighbors and shopkeepers to see if anyone had seen Dorothy leaving the building. Every investigation led nowhere. There was no evidence that Dorothy had left the room by physical means. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no body. There was simply a child who had been present in a room full of witnesses and then had ceased to be present, with no explanation that fit within the boundaries of normal physical reality. The academic community reacted with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Dr. Mackenzie's report on the case was reviewed by multiple scholars, some of whom dismissed it as fraud or delusion, others who considered it the most significant linguistic mystery of the century. The wax cylinder recordings of Dorothy's speech were studied extensively, with researchers confirming that the languages recorded were genuinely structured and sophisticated, not the invented babbling of a child. Several papers were published analyzing the linguistic characteristics of Dorothy's languages, with scholars debating whether they represented some unknown branch of the human linguistic family tree, or whether they might be evidence of languages from human civilizations that had completely vanished from the historical record. May and William Chen never recovered from the loss of their daughter. May fell into a deep depression, rarely leaving the apartment, spending hours sitting in Dorothy's empty bedroom. William continued to operate the grocery store, but neighbors said he had become a ghost of his former self, working mechanically but with no joy or energy. The couple had no more children. They lived in that apartment above the store until William's death in 1937 and May's death in 1942, both dying of what their death certificates listed as heart failure, but what those who knew them understood to be broken hearts. The apartment remained empty for several years after May's death, local residents viewing it as cursed or haunted. When a new tenant finally moved in during 1945, they reported hearing strange sounds at night, voices speaking in unintelligible languages, the sound of a child's footsteps in empty rooms. These reports continued sporadically over the decades, with different tenants in different years describing similar experiences, always involving strange languages and the sense of a child's presence. The building still stands on Washington Street today, though it has been renovated multiple times and no longer houses a grocery store. Current residents report no unusual experiences, though local historians in Chinatown still tell the story of Dorothy Chen, the girl who spoke in ancient tongues and vanished into the place where dead languages go to rest. Dr. Mackenzie spent the remaining 15 years of his career trying to decode the recordings of Dorothy's speech, hoping to understand the nature of the languages she had spoken, and perhaps to find clues about where she might have gone. He published one final paper in 1933, shortly before his death, in which he concluded that Dorothy's languages showed no clear relationship to any known human linguistic family, but demonstrated characteristics that suggested they might be ancestral to several modern language groups. He proposed that Dorothy had somehow accessed linguistic knowledge from a period of human history that predated all known civilizations, languages that had been spoken during some lost golden age of humanity and had been preserved somehow outside normal historical channels. He ended his paper with a statement that was controversial then and remains controversial today. The case of Dorothy Chen forces us to consider the possibility that human knowledge is not limited to what we can learn through ordinary experience and education, that there may exist repositories of information that transcend normal time and space, and that occasionally, for reasons we do not understand, an individual may gain access to this impossible knowledge. What happened to Dorothy Chen was not madness or fraud, but rather a glimpse into layers of reality that our current scientific framework cannot accommodate. The 14 languages that Dorothy spoke have never been identified or decoded, despite decades of additional study. The recordings remain in the archives of the University of California, Berkeley, available to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest. Several linguists have attempted to create comprehensive grammars and vocabularies of Dorothy's languages based on the recorded samples, but the limited amount of data makes this nearly impossible. What we have are fragments of 14 sophisticated linguistic systems, each apparently complete and structured, but without sufficient context or translation keys to fully understand them. The mystery of where Dorothy Chen went and where those languages came from remains unsolved. Some believe she truly did travel to some other realm or dimension where ancient knowledge is preserved, taken there by entities that exist outside normal space and time. Others believe that Dorothy suffered some form of psychological break that allowed her to generate complex linguistic systems from her own subconscious mind, and that her disappearance was either death by misadventure that was never discovered or a deliberate running away that succeeded completely. Still others believe that Dorothy's case represents something we cannot yet understand, some intersection of consciousness, language, memory, and reality that transcends our current scientific framework. What is certain is that a 9-year-old girl began speaking in languages that should not exist, carried knowledge that should not be accessible, and ultimately vanished from physical reality in a way that defied all rational explanation. The case challenges our assumptions about the nature of knowledge, the limits of human consciousness, and the boundaries between the visible world and whatever may lie beyond. Do you believe Dorothy Chen traveled to some other realm, or is there a rational explanation we haven't yet discovered? Leave your comment below and tell us what you think happened to the girl who spoke in dead languages and vanished into mystery. If this story made you question the boundaries of human knowledge and the nature of reality itself, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates mysteries that refuse to be explained. Remember, there are more things in heaven and earth than our science has yet dreamed of. And sometimes, the most impossible stories are the truest ones. See you in the next video.